loser for quite some time, and they both came down and got me out of that relationship, and him and I were at Tacos and Tequilas in Buckhead, and I said, Daddy, you know, if this is the hard decision I had to make, you need to make that decision too. You need to be happy. I mean, I would text them when they would say, oh, Daddy, you know, or Mama would send me something, a screenshot, or being mad with Daddy, and I'd be like, y'all need to figure this out. Like, y'all are gonna have a heart attack one day. Or like Daddy would complain about something and I'd be like, y'all need to figure it out. This is not my problem. It's just, I thought of that Purcell house as they both knew what they were getting into. And at that point, my hands were off of it. I said, that's y'all's problem.
Okay. So tell me if I'm wrong, because I'm just going off the way you just said this. But it sounds like your parents, this is just how they were.
Yes.
And when I say the way they were, the kind of the way that they would just kind of bicker and complain about each other, that was just a two-way street, and that's what they did. That's how they communicated.
Yes. And that's what they both accepted and wanted to do.
That's what they wanted to do.
Yes.
That was
my dad
norm.
told me, he said, I love her and I'm not leaving her. So that was his choice, not mine. He knew my opinion.
Okay. But those strange maybe to the outside world, to them,
that was their choice.
that was life.
They were both adults. They knew exactly what they were doing.
So back to Scott. And how did it come to pass that he wound up on the farm that you knew of?
Because he couldn't make it on his own. It was kind of a running joke that he just was always going to, he'd complain that, oh, Mama told me to do this, or Daddy told me to do that. And I'm like, well, move out. Like, it's as simple as that. Like, don't live with your parents. They always said, oh, I'm going to work on the farm, or I'd work on the farm and things like, yeah, he did. I mean, I guess, but so did my dad, so did my mom. It was a kid that was living at home. And that was about it.
Do you think he was taking advantage of them?
I think anybody who asks their parents for money over the age of 20, 25 are taking advantage of people. Okay. I think it's a moment in a person's life where you have to say, I'm an adult, I need to grow up.
Okay. Do you did you know about kind of his daily life, about him just playing golf and not really actually working on the farm very much?
It was off of what I was told.
Okay. Nothing you saw?
No. I mean, he was out there. When I went out to visit my parents, you couldn't go on the property without him he'd come up right in it immediately, but like, he would see what was going on and then he would leave and he would go back. Like Christmas, or even dinners on weekends when we would go, he would come in, make his plate, and he'd go back to his little apartment. And that was like the most we saw of him. And
like, he would take the plate and go back to the barn apartment?
Yeah. He never
wouldn't sit with the family? No.
Occasionally he would sit at the bar stool, like in the kitchen, but.
And this is Scott, not your dad?
Correct.
Okay. If you had to say which kids were closest to which parent?
I mean, my dad and Emily always had a really good relationship, but she lived in Tennessee, so that's kind of hard to judge.
Sure.
My husband is a really big advocate of family, and looking back on it, I didn't have that lovey-dovey family relationship that everybody grew up with, and I wanted to cultivate that, and I made an effort to spend that time with my parents. So we would go out there almost every weekend and have dinner with them. And I mean, I was looking back through our text messages, and it felt like every weekend, baby girl, when am I going to get to see you? I'll be up there this weekend. So I really tried to get as close as I possibly could, but my dad was really hard to get close to. He was very shut off to a certain point. But I think he did that because we were his kids. I think it was different for the other people.
Like what other people? Would it have been different?
Like my husband would have conversations with him. They would have great conversations from what I heard. Like when we went over there for dinners, they'd go outside. My dad smoked cigarettes. Chad vaped at the time. They'd go outside and they would just chit chat. And they had great conversations. More than I could get out of him, I guess I should say.
Okay. So I want to start kind of moving into events in y'all's family life that would have been part of maybe the Ferris wheel, and get your version of the events to tell the jury. About the time you were in college, can you tell the jury about Ted Wiley? What you know about that?
Well, going back to my senior year of high school, my grandmother, my mother's mother, had open heart surgery. And she had to go up there and stay with her all the time. And my father would text me and tell my other siblings about Ted, and it was a speculation at first. And then it came to a point where my father would send me pictures of things that were not appropriate, that were possibly sent to my mother's phone. And at that point, I told him I didn't want to be involved and I didn't want to know. I felt like I was a child at that point and I didn't need to be involved, and I was very upset. So it ended up that it turned out really bad, and she went up there and was, I guess, I don't know if she was staying with him, I didn't ask. But my dad was at home and he was alone, and I was at Georgia Southern and I wasn't doing well anyways, and I said, I'm going to come home and I'm going to live with my dad. And I did. I came home and I lived, and it was not long after that that my mom came in and she decided to come back home. And at that time, I didn't want to be there. I didn't want to be involved. So I was dating a guy at the time. He had an apartment and I went and lived with him. One of the worst decisions I've ever made.
This was that loser you were telling us
That was
about.
that loser.
Okay. And so that's what you remember from that era?
From that era, yes.
But your dad knew about it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he was...
And everybody else in the family?
Everybody knew about it.
Okay. And would you just, kind of earlier you said about kind of the bickering and the way that they would communicate, that just became part of everybody's life.
Yeah.
Would you give that same assessment to any extramarital relationships both your parents would have?
I didn't know of any extramarital affairs that my father had.
Okay. But even your mom, as far as how it just became accepted by the family, and this was, though odd, this is how we live.
It was accepted because my father accepted it. I just made a comment that was not the best about my mother to my father, and he got very mad at me. He said I was not to speak to her about her like that. And after that, I didn't talk to him about it, and I stayed out of it. And that's where I left it. It was his choice. So that was it. That was their normal. They accepted it. They knew what they were doing.
Okay. What about the other siblings? Did y'all talk about it at all?
Oh yeah, we talked about it. They had far more anger for my mother, which I felt like I should have had, just because I feel like there were moments of manipulation in the sense of like, I'd go up to Alabama with her, and I think that she would kind of use me as like, oh, I'm going up with Amanda, and then I'd be left at home, or I don't know. It's all speculation. All I can do is assume, but I don't feel like things were not going the way that they should have, and I think sins were committed in that I think both of them needed to address, and they didn't. They refused to.
Okay. So, kind of moving back closer in time, is it fair to say that Scott and your mother were actually pretty close?
Oh, they spent almost every day together. They would go up to what is called, I think, Scottsdale Farms. Scott loved to decorate. He was always doing something, whether it be outside or inside the barn, or they were always together. They always went up to Cherokee Ranch. I mean, all of us did everything with my mom.
What does that mean?
We all had a relationship with her. And Chris took his girls to be with her all the time. I don't know if they necessarily I guess they did stuff together. I didn't see where they did.
Did you know that the girls basically, when Chris would get them from Maine, they would spend the vast majority of their time
they came over to my mother's.
And they would call her Grandma. Did you know that?
Yes.
Okay.
They spent all their time with my mother. She was great grandmother. His great grandmother.
And she keeps your son, correct?
She did.
Okay. So they were close. Did they ever fight? Any altercations?
I'm sure.
Well, what you would have known.
I think they would fight when my mother would call them out on their stuff, and they didn't like it. And I'm sure that they felt the same way about her. But I mean, there was always an underlying anger that never went away.